Hello and welcome to Mysteries of Science. I'm Stevie and I'm the Deputy Editor of Science and Nature, the monthly magazine from the team behind The Week Junior.
And I'm Michael, the Junior Editor. Science helps us understand the universe, but there are some strange cases it still hasn't solved, including this one.
Many of you will be familiar with the pyramids of ancient Egypt, one of the wonders of the world.
But do you know how the Egyptians built these magnificent structures?
Do you know why they built them?
And do you know what's lurking on the inside?
Join us as we go back in time to get some answers. This is Mysteries of Science.
Ancient Egypt. You know, I've always been fascinated by this period of history, Stevie. The mummies, the pharaohs, the pyramids. There's just so much to explore.
Yes, and now is a perfect time to discuss it, as this month marks 100 years since the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun.
Yes, some of you might remember we did an entire episode on King Tut's curse back in season 1 of Mysteries of Science.
It was one of our first ever episodes and well worth a listen if you haven't heard it already.
But not before you finish listening to this one.
Now, Michael, you say you love ancient Egypt, but do you know when ancient Egypt actually was? What period of time we are actually talking about?
You know, I don't actually. I think I'm going to need some help here.
Well, luckily for you, we've got someone who knows the answer.
I'm Joanne Fletcher, and I'm an Egyptologist and a professor in the Department of Archaeology at the University of York.
An Egyptologist? What's that?
Well, Egyptology is the best subject in the world. It is basically the study of ancient Egypt, its culture, its religion, its architecture, anything and everything to do with ancient Egypt. And it's something that I've done virtually my whole life, and it's an all-consuming, wonderful thing that it's quite addictive, really. It's not like working at all, it's just having fun quite a lot of the time.
What made you want to become an Egyptologist, Joanne?
Yeah, I've always been interested in ancient Egypt as long as I could remember, even before I could read. I think it was the pictures of ancient Egyptians in my parents' history books at home which really ignited a passion in me. All these wonderful pictures of ancient Egyptians, very colourful, always smiling, very idealised, and the way they chose to portray themselves really struck a chord with me. And then by the time I was 6, the Tutankhamun exhibition came to the British Museum for the first time. That was in 1972. And Tutankhamun's image was everywhere, on all the children's programmes, on the news, in the newspapers. And I just became a mega fan of Tutankhamun. And I distinctly remember over dinner one night, my mum actually said, well, Egyptology is a real subject and you can do it as a job. You can become an Egyptologist. And that was at the age of 6, and that's all I've ever done.
Another Tutankhamun fan. So tell us, Joanne, just how ancient is ancient Egypt?
Well, the standard textbooks will tell us ancient Egypt began 3100 BC and ends around 30 BC. This is kind of accurate, but certainly colleagues out in Egypt at the moment are pushing back the beginnings of ancient Egyptian history all the time. We were privileged to work with a wonderful archaeologist called Dr. Dirk Huyger, and he and his team were able to locate Egypt's oldest art, and that's around 17,000 years old. So that's pretty incredible. It sort of pushes back this apparent beginning date of 3100 BC over 1400 years back in time. So I think the sort of what ancient Egypt really is a culture, a civilization that began far more early than people imagine. So that's the excitement for me. Nothing is set in stone with ancient Egypt. Everything we know can at any point be overturned by a new piece of evidence. It keeps the subject so fresh, so exciting, and a joy to be part of.
So how ancient is ancient Egypt? Very, it seems. Now, where do the pyramids fit in?
Well, the pyramids are an enduring image of ancient Egypt. Everybody either thinks Tutankhamun or the pyramids, and rightly so. The pyramids are massive, massive structures. The Great Pyramid at Giza, for instance, the world's tallest building until the building of Lincoln Cathedral in the 1300s in our country. And in Egypt, there are 138 pyramids that have been found so far. That sounds a bit weird. How on earth can you lose a pyramid? How can you keep rediscovering them? Well, most of them are not of the same massive dimensions as the big three at Giza. There are some quite small ones, and under sand drifts and so forth, some of them have become lost over time and are rediscovered every now and again.
Losing a pyramid sounds like something I'd managed to do, to be fair. So that's how many there are, but why are they there in the first place? I mean, sure, they look amazing, but what's the point of them?
There are a lot of daft things on the internet especially, and crazy theories that they were built by spacemen and they align to some strange kind of points in distant galaxies. The truth is, they were built as royal tombs. And we know this because royal mummies have been found inside them sometimes. Parts of royal mummies, parts of the royal coffins and all the funerary paraphernalia that went along with such burials. So I can categorically say they are royal tombs. The vast majority were robbed in antiquity because obviously if you're burying a pharaoh or a queen amidst golden treasures, it doesn't take a genius for a tomb robber to find where the gold is. You just dig underneath the big pointy buildings. And so the vast majority were robbed in ancient times as well as in more recent years. So basically what we have are these huge buildings. Quite often they look very empty inside to the modern eye, and yet when you look through the archaeological data, through the information left by archaeologists, you can see quite clearly that the royal mummies and parts of royal mummies were found inside. So we can say with confidence these were royal tombs.
Okay, so that's pretty definitive then. No aliens here. The Egyptians built the pyramids themselves, and they built them to be royal tombs.
So we know what the pyramids are and why the Egyptians built them, but how did they do it?
Well, Stevie, that's one of the biggest mysteries surrounding the pyramids, and to get to the bottom of it, I think we need to speak to an engineer.
My name is Peter James. I'm the Managing Director of Syntec International.
So Peter's company, Syntec International, is called in to sort of strengthen and repair ancient structures around the world when they've been damaged by events like fires or earthquakes. So he's worked on Windsor Castle here in the UK, the Statue of Liberty in the US, but most importantly for us, he's worked on the pyramids, and his work in Egypt even inspired him to write a book called Saving the Pyramids, 21st Century Engineering and Egypt's Ancient Monuments.
So Peter, tell us, what was it like when you saw a pyramid for the very first time?
I went to Mina House, which is a hotel adjacent to Giza, and it was probably just getting at sunset, and I was a passenger, and I got out of the car, and in front of me was this tree, and I thought, what's that black big cloud behind it? Because it was a clear day in Cairo. I thought, what's that black cloud? And then I realised it was the pyramid. It was one of those magical moments when you think, well, my God, look at that. I mean, the sheer size of it, and the amount of effort and time and scaffolding and the various things that went with it. It was amazing.
Now, Peter hasn't just seen the pyramids from the outside. His work has taken him deep inside them, where he says he experienced a very strange feeling.
Inside the pyramid itself, it was strange that if you were in it by yourself and there was no one else there, you had a distinct feeling that someone was looking at you. I don't know if you ever that feeling that you feel that someone's looking at you, you don't know who it is. And because you're right in the middle of this very, very thick forest of stone, and you think, well, what's going on in here?
Oh, it sounds spooky.
Yeah, I definitely would not want to be left inside a pyramid on my own. Now, as a result of his work on the pyramids, Peter actually came up with a new idea for how they were built.
I decided that I should write a book because I don't think they've got it right the way that they were built. If you look at a builder, if he's going to build a bungalow or a house, a square house, he starts on the four corners, and the corners are built up and then infilled. And that's exactly what happened.
So, is Peter saying that the ancient Egyptians used some of the same building techniques we use today?
Exactly. So some archaeologists who are experts who study man-made objects to help us understand the past, they thought that the Egyptians would have used these massive ramps to move the stones up the outside of the pyramid, but Peter says he didn't see any signs of that, and he actually thinks that they built the pyramids almost from the inside out rather than the outside in.
How interesting. Speaking of the inside as well, we know these were royal tombs, which gives us some idea of what's inside them. And Peter has described walking through this thick forest of stone. But what else might be lurking inside these ancient structures?
I think we need one more expert to help us out here.
Hello, my name's Dr. Chris Naunton and I'm an Egyptologist.
Now, when we spoke to Chris, he had just come back from a trip to Egypt and was getting ready to go back out there again.
This year's been very busy for me because the kind of travel that I do to Egypt was more or less impossible during the pandemic. And there's been a bit of a backlog, so I'm just back. I'm going again on Tuesday. That will be my 7th visit this year, and I'm generally there for 2 to 3 weeks, something like that. So this has been a very busy year. I think 7 might even be my record number of visits in a single year, but it's about half a dozen is about normal for me.
Wow, 7 visits in 1 year. I wish Chris could take us with him.
Well, maybe he can take us with him in our imaginations. Chris, tell us, what is it like travelling towards the pyramids?
The thing is, they're so huge that you first see them from a long way away. So, if your journey to them starts in the centre of Cairo, you're probably, I'm not sure of the exact distance, maybe 10 or 20 kilometres away. But you'll catch sight of them a good kind of 15 or 20 minutes before you actually arrive at the site. And the way that Cairo is now, with lots and lots of modern buildings, some very tall buildings, when you're on the road on the way to the site, you often catch your first glimpse of it as you're travelling along the road. It just appears suddenly in between buildings and then disappears again. And I'm often with people who are seeing the pyramids for the first time, and generally speaking, when people first see the pyramid in that way, in between buildings, it's a great moment. People gasp when they see them because they are so massive, so much bigger than any buildings still today in Egypt even. And then by the time you're standing next to them, you've probably had them in your sight for 10 or 20 minutes as you approach them. So by the time you get up to the base, they're so big that you can't really see the shape of them at all. All you can really see are the enormous stone blocks that they're built from. So it's a bit like being in front of a giant wall at that point. You don't get any sense of the triangular shape of them at all because you're just too close.
So, like Peter, Chris has stepped inside the pyramids, and not just any pyramid, the Great Pyramid. So, Chris, tell us, how do you get inside a pyramid? Say we're some of those tomb robbers out to steal some buried treasure. Where would we go?
So, in the case of the Great Pyramid, let's take that one to begin with. In that case, the burial chamber is within the structure of the pyramid itself. The pyramid itself is about 150 metres in height, and the burial chamber is very roughly, I'd say, a third to halfway up the total height of the pyramid. So it's right in the middle. So from the ground, you need to be going up at a certain point. In actual fact, the way that we enter the pyramid now is via a robber's tunnel, which was cut into the pyramid a few courses of blocks up from the bottom. So it's probably something like 10 or 20 meters up from the base of the pyramid. So you enter what's a very roughly cut passageway running horizontally, and that then it breaks through into what was the originally intended entrance passageway, which leads upwards. So in modern times, the Ministry of Antiquities in Egypt has installed a kind of wooden walkway with little kind of steps on it to help you, and some banisters on either side so that you can help to pull yourself up. So you go up for a bit. This then opens out into another ascending passageway, a passageway going upwards, but it's much, much bigger. It's called the Grand Gallery. This goes up even further, and that eventually takes you to the burial chamber.
Hearing Chris talk about the inside of the Great Pyramid has reminded me of one of its biggest mysteries.
What's that, Stevie?
Well, recently a group of scientists took a sort of X-ray of the Great Pyramid and discovered that there was a large empty space, which they nicknamed the Big Void, deep inside it. It's similar in size to the Grand Gallery, which Chris just mentioned, but it's never been entered in modern times.
How strange. Do you have any idea what could be in there, Chris?
Well, the problem here really is that we don't really know of any other similar empty chambers like this in any other pyramids. That's not to say that they aren't there. It could just be that we haven't found them. But by and large, pyramids are very solid structures, and the only spaces within them are chambers which we think were either there for the purposes of burying somebody, or they're of course the passageways that provide access to those burial chambers. The only other kinds of chamber that we have in pyramids, at least as far as our interpretations go, are chambers which are there to help reduce the weight of the structure and to help to distribute the weight of the stone blocks above the burial chamber and the passageways around those spaces so that they don't collapse. So those are sometimes called relieving chambers. So, as regards what this mysterious space inside the Great Pyramid would be, I think, first of all, it's very unlikely to not have a purpose, to just be an empty space for no reason. And there would have been a very good reason for it being there. The Egyptians were very, very clear and precise in everything they did when it came to pyramid construction, it seems. So I think most probably, if and when we are able to identify that chamber in some way to get into it, perhaps, and investigate it, I don't expect that there will be any inscriptions or anything like that to give us clear ideas about what the purpose of the room was. And I should think the interpretation would be either that it's a burial place for a subsidiary, a kind of secondary person, somebody connected to the king, or it's an engineering chamber designed to help ensure that the whole structure can stay upright and not collapse.
I guess we just need to watch this space then, literally.
Okay, I think it's time to crack out our old friend the mysteryometer. Tell us, Chris, on a scale of 0 to 100, how much do we know about the pyramids?
Oh, that's a really good question. 55, I would say, is how much we know. We don't really have any idea what kinds of things would have been left inside the pyramid at the time the king was buried there, because almost everything has been robbed away in ancient times. We don't know what kinds of rituals would have been performed. We don't know what kinds of buildings and what kinds of activities there would have been in and around the pyramids. We don't know exactly how they were built. We don't know how the stones were moved into place. We don't know how the Egyptians were able to achieve the incredible precision with which they built the pyramids. And it's worth pointing out that the dimensions and the alignment of the blocks, the alignment of the whole of the Great Pyramid. The Great Pyramid in particular, by the way, is not only the biggest, but it's also the finest, most precisely designed and built. We simply do not know how the Egyptians were able to do things so accurately. I understand, for example, that the right angles at the corners of the Great Pyramid are more closely accurate to exactly 90 degrees than modern buildings would be now. It could just be that they needed to be that accurate because they were building on such a great scale, but we still don't really understand how they did that. We know a good amount, but I'd say not much more than there is that we don't know.
So it sounds like there's still a lot left for us to discover then.
Yes, and who knows, maybe some of our listeners will be the ones to make those discoveries.
If any of you have been inspired to become an Egyptologist after listening to this episode, then Joanne has some words of advice for you.
I think if any listeners are really interested in maybe becoming an Egyptologist or wanting to know more, just be very, very careful about the sources that are consulted, because there are a lot of quite wacky websites out there that claim all sorts of things. It's always best to stick to the sort of more academic, more evidence-based websites. And a great place to start would be the Egypt Exploration Society. If you look up the Egypt Exploration Society online and look at their digital resources, they have some wonderful things that really help to connect with ancient Egypt. And it's a wonderful society to support and to learn from. So that would be a big recommendation from me for your listeners.
That's some good advice. You should always be careful what you read and only trust reliable sources.
Reliable sources like the Week Junior Science and Nature magazine.
Exactly.
Now, that's almost it for this season of Mysteries of Science, but don't fear, because we're back for one more episode and we need your help.
Do you have any questions you'd like to know the answer to? Our next and final episode of Season 4 is dedicated to your mysteries. Send us your questions and we'll put them to the experts.
To send us a voice recording, head to funkidslive.com/mysteries and tap the big red button. We can't wait to hear from you. Until then,
Stay curious.
Thanks for listening to this podcast, which is made by the same people that make the Week Junior magazine. You can get 6 free issues of the Week Junior or 3 issues of the Week Junior Science and Nature for £5 by heading to theweekjunior.co.uk/podcast offer.